Acts 27, sold. Here we go. As for those of you, if you're visiting with us, we have been going through the entire book of Acts, pretty much word for word, right? I don't think I've skipped any verses along the way. I think we've literally together read all of it and then commented along the way. Hopefully, you thought some of it was beneficial. I have certainly enjoyed doing this, and we only have we've got Sunday, Wednesday left. Okay, so today we're going to cover 27. We're going to see how that goes. Sunday, we're going to do 28. And then we'll see about the following Wednesday. I think what I'm going to attempt to do is cover a little bit of the time that follows Acts in Paul's life and maybe a little bit of Peter's life. If we could piece together some things from 1st, 2nd Timothy, Titus. It is not like Acts, though, okay? And that's why I don't want to do it on Sunday morning. I'd rather do it on Wednesday when you all are here that are wanting that Bible study, maybe extra, and then not quite so many people that might wonder why we could, I don't know, have you ever done a inter-testament study where you're looking at what happened between the Old Testament and New Testament? Well, you can see some things from Scripture where that led, but you can't read Scripture and see exactly what all those events were. In Acts, we know the event. After event after event, here's what happened, here's what happened. But I think on a week from today, we're going to try to talk a little bit about post-Acts briefly, and we'll see how that goes. We left off in Acts 20. I know where I was going with this, though. Thank you. Y'all have been so kind. And I always try to tell people that are considering teaching a class or considering giving a talk. I know Ben was really nervous with that tonight. That y'all are Nobody roots for the teacher speaker more than this family, right? It's a very comfortable, nice place to try to present anything, the word, in that y'all are always so supportive with that, and I appreciate that, because especially this evening on a Wednesday, I get tired. We may see how it goes. If I get off track any more than I already have, just yell out. So up on the screen in front of you, in the end of Acts 26, let me do that one more time. I just started on. I don't know. Hey, Chris, can you do that for me once? Thank you. There we go. At the end of 26, we finished with Paul presenting to Herod Agrippa II, right? It just says Agrippa here. And David and I had an interesting little brief conversation out in the hall. Agrippa, at the end of Paul's, his preaching, his explanation, his walking through the events that have happened, as he's teaching, he's talking about the prophets. And at the end of his talk, in front of all this pomp, all these people that are there, King Agrippa, he says in verse 27, "Do you believe the prophets? I know that you do." And Agrippa replied to Paul, "In a short time you will persuade me to be a Christian," right? That word's not used a lot. When was the other time we mentioned it was used, the first time it was used? Remember what chapter that was? Acts 11, Christians are the brethren, right? And so here we are. What is the reasonable conclusion of knowing the prophets, believing the prophets? Well, according to Agrippa, it's, I know where you're going with this. You want me to be a Christian. And I thank you for that. It was a nice tie-in. So we left there, and the assumption is they gave Paul a good report, meaning that was the whole reason to have this group, was to see what are we going to send to Rome. And it seems like, while they still determined that he was going no matter what, because they put the actual hearing on hold because he appealed to Caesar, that it does seem like they must have at least thought well enough of him to send him something with the centurion, with everyone else. They're all treating Paul pretty well on this trip, and we'll see that continue. But they do end up on a ship. They were going to set sail for Italy, chapter 27, verse 1. The centurion with them, again in verse 1, is named Julius. They started on an Adramyttian ship. We talked about that in verse 2, sailing along the regions of the coast of Asia, and put out to sea accompanied by Aristarchus, who we talked about in Acts 19 already. Let's see if I can get over here to this. So we are mostly going to talk about a boat ride this evening. So they've already made their way up this way, and it's going to talk about the weather. The next day we put in that Sidon and Julius treated Paul with consideration. Remember, that's kindness, philanthropy, that word. And allowed him to go receive his friends with care. That's in Sidon and, where was that? Right there. Thanks, Chris. That's pretty cool. I didn't do that. Chris did that. So that's where that is. And from there put out to sea and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. And so you see up here, I think last time I was talking off the top of my head, I was kind of saying it was this way. The winds are kind of this way. We're going to know that a little later on. It's going to have the winds be a name like we do ours. And it tells direction with that. So the winds in that area this time of year start going this way. So that instead of coming out here where they'd be really exposed, they stay up by the land, we're going to see that a little later on as well. And in verse 5, I think this is about where we stopped off, maybe 5 or 6. When we'd sailed through the sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed in Myra in Lycia. Lycia is the region there, right? You see the region there? So here's where they landed in that port town in Myra. There the centurion, Julius, found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy, and he put us aboard it. When we'd sailed slowly for a good many days and with difficulty had arrived off Cnidus, since the wind did not permit us to go further, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmone. So you see here, there's Crete. And so instead of doing maybe the more direct route, they're looking for a little more shelter down here under Crete. And a good many days. I want to mention this. It says they sailed for a good many days. Oh, by the way, I think I mentioned the Alexandrian ship. That means it's Egyptian, right? It had to do with the trade between Egypt and Rome, most likely. In this case, we're going to find out it was wheat, and that would have been fairly common. It's a big, big ship. I'm going to show you a picture of what it might look like in a second. But that trip, that's about 150 miles, okay? And it says a good many days. Look over in chapter 28, verse 13. This is after they're on a different ship and they're sailing, in this case, about 180 miles. In verse 13, they did it in less than 2 days. Okay? So 180 miles, less than 2 days. 150 miles, a good many days. They're not thrilled with the way this is going in here, right? This is a bad trip already. Yes?
I'm King James, and it says that they slowly sailed for the day. And that may be why it took longer, because they're sailing slower because of the wind.
Because of the wind, exactly right. This time of year, and we're going to see that a little later on, this time of the year is not really the year they should be making these trips ideally, okay? Earlier in the year is better. By November, they're basically prohibited from going. And so they're in this time period of maybe early October, maybe late October, because we talked about I guess we did go a little further, didn't we? The upcoming feast that was coming up, the holiday. And so they knew that he knew that this was getting late in the season because the weather is always bad. Like after November, you don't do this. Before it, it's a little bit within your discretion. But then if it had been in July, August, it would have been normal sailing, nice weather, pleasant, except for the most unusual circumstances. So then they're here. They didn't, let's see, verse 7, since the wind did not permit us to go further, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmone, and with difficulty sailing past it, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lycia. So here we are in Fair Havens. Can you jump out for me again there, Chris? Thank you very much. So here we are in Fair Havens, just a little bit here. But look at this. That's pretty exposed, right? And so it's on the correct side of the wind, but it's not a particularly big bay, and we're going to see that here. That's where they stopped. With considerable wind, verse 9, when considerable time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over, Paul began to admonish them. That Day of Atonement is that fast there. It's in my notes now. And said to them, men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. Is he speaking through the Spirit? Is he speaking of his own experience? 2 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians 11:25 that we've referred to. Let's look at that real quick. 2 Corinthians 11:35 says, 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A day and a night I have spent in the deep. I've been on frequent journeys, in dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my countrymen, dangers from the Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers on the sea, dangers among false brethren. And he goes in labor and hardship, talks about other things. It's pretty much universally agreed that 2 Corinthians was written before the shipwreck. Okay, so he's already got a lot of experience with these things, and he's saying, this is a bad time of year. I'm predicting if we keep going, we're going to have big losses. Essentially saying, better to weather here than, in looking for a better port in the storm. And I don't necessarily think this was the Holy Spirit revealing this to him because of the way God reveals something to him later so distinctly, but it could have been. But let's see what happens. In verse 11, the centurion, but the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship than what was being said by Paul. Who are the experts? The pilot. Maybe the pilot might be the owner. There's another word that's kind of substituted in there. The owner of the ship, the one that's risked all this stuff. The pilot, the one that's been put in charge of all this. The captain, the one that they're paying to get them safely, but's got all the experience. Who should they listen to? And the centurion, who, one of the reasons it seems like it is definitely a Rome and Egyptian trade route is because who are they asking here? Who's in charge? Not exactly the owner, or the pilot, not exactly the captain. The centurion was more persuaded. You see that Julius, at the end of the day, makes a decision. Probably because he's the highest ranking authority from Rome. It may also be because he's the one with all the soldiers, right? I don't know. I feel like either way, he's kind of in charge. But he listens to them. And so they're stopped in Fair Havens. Verse 12. Because the harbor was not suitable for wintering, the majority reached a decision to put out to sea from there if somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. All right, so where are they at? Well, they're already in Crete. Here they are in Fair Havens. All they're really talking about doing is going a little further. You see this little thing there? I think that's an island. A little further up this way, maybe even coming around this side. It's not known, okay? But that's where that Phoenix up there, there's some debate about where Phoenix might have been at the time. There's even a little bit of debate that we're even on the right island later on, which is funny. But that seems to be where they're going to go. And let's see, all they're doing is going around the corner. And when a moderate wind, this is verse 13, when a moderate south wind came up, supposing that they had attained their purpose, meaning, okay, perfect opportunity, the wind has died down a little bit, we're going to be able to go around here. They weighed anchor and began sailing along Crete, close inshore. But before very long, there rushed down from the land a violent wind called the Eurykilo, and when the ship was caught in it and could not face the wind, we gave to it and let ourselves be driven along. So they thought they were just going to go around the corner, they'd get a better place to winter, and the Eurykilo comes in. Is that what your Bibles say? Is that a big long word? What? Euroclydon, that's another word they use there, and I have no idea what the difference is. And another word? Northeaster. That's what we call the northeaster. Why? Because that's where the winds are coming from. Right? That's why I said that they're coming from this direction, not coming from this direction. It could also really be coming this way somewhat, but it's a common thing, meaning these sailors knew what that was. This was a seasonal thing that happened every once in a while. What do we have that comes through here seasonally? And I forget the name of it. They talk about this wind that comes through every once in a while that affects, what's that? El Nino, right? It's winds, seasonal, yet somewhat predictable. Once it's here, everybody knows it's here. They have that same kind of thing over there. And, okay, I thought somebody yelled, hey, Matt, but I think it was, bless you. Okay, so when the ship was caught in it and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and let ourselves be driven along. If they're letting themselves be driven along, which way do they have to be going? They have to be going with the wind. And now you got sails, right? But they got to be going this way. They can't go back this direction. They're being driven along by the wind. Running along the shelter of a small island called Clauda, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. Some of your all's translations may not say ship's boat. It made it look like they couldn't get the boat under control. They couldn't get the ship under control. That's not what they're talking about. The second verse there, verse 17, gives us that context. So after they had hoisted it up, they used supporting cables, and I know we'll talk about that in a second. So what were they doing? They're pulling in the dinghy, right? Verse 16, you've got another boat to support the various going back and forth to land, small crews, that kind of thing. And it's also tossing around. It's probably full of a lot of water. And it was more or less all hands on deck. Who was scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control or the dinghy under control? We. Who's the we? Who's writing this? Luke, right? So here you've got even Dr. Luke out there struggling to pull this thing up into the ship so that it wouldn't be lost. And that's important for later on what happens in this chapter, okay? So they struggled and pulled it under control. And if you look at verse 17 again, after they had hoisted it up, that dinghy, that ship's boat, they used supporting cables in and undergirding the ship, and fearing that they might run aground on the shallows of Syrtis, they let down the sea anchor, and in this way let themselves be driven along. Supporting cables, think about what's the ship made out of? Wood. Lots and lots of force being put on this wood. So they carried cabling that they would wrap then around the frame of this thing in order to give some extra undergirding is the word that was used, strength to that. It also would really affect your sailing, right? It's nice to have a nice smooth wood under there. That's normal. But then when they really don't care about fast sailing anymore, they put this cable under there to strengthen it. And the shallows of Syrtis, you can imagine an area, it's a lot of sand, and they don't ever know exactly where that sand is located. Think of sandbars. They don't want to be pushed over there. They don't know exactly where that is. It's hard to find. It sort of moves around a lot. They let down their sea anchor, and in this way let themselves be driven along. New term for me, I had to look it up. What's a sea anchor? What are they talking about? Why would you drop an anchor out when you're flying down the way? A sea anchor. Exactly. They throw it off the back. It's likely not one of those big hook things we think of, right? It's not really intended to jam itself in the ground and catch on something. It's potentially just the weight that's going to drag, that's going to get the ship a little more forward facing, as opposed to just getting whipped to the side as the current or the wind may want. Does that make sense? So they're now dragging this big anchor out the back, just trying to have some control over the front. Verse 18. The next day, as we were being violently stormed. Who's getting nauseous, by the way, right now? Right? I mean, have you ever? I was on a day cruise one time from Miami to the Bahamas when I was about 22 years old, and the waves came up. This is a cruise ship, right? They got a pool up there. They had to drain the pool because it was knocking people down on deck because it was so rough that the water would come out, and there were people lined up in the halls with barf bags. It was gross, right? But that's we're talking about something big getting whipped around on this ship, being violently storm tossed. They began to jettison the cargo, and on the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their hands. All right, we'll skip this for a second, come back. I asked, you ever use ChatGPT? It's kind of weird. I asked it if it could give me a good explanation, a definition, a description, verbal description of a first century Alexandrian ship that could hold at least 270 people. And it came out with this massive amount of information, paragraphs, and even said, one of the best known examples was of Paul when he traveled into Acts 27. And I said, well, using that above description, can you give me a rendering that would be, I forget what the word I used, but that would match that definition you just gave? And that's what it gave. So I don't know if it's true or not. But that was ChatGPT's version. There's a little dinghy down there. Look, can you see here? That's the scale. Those are people, right? That would be the scale of this ship. And it gave some amount of examples. Not scriptural examples. I don't know the exact length and width of this thing. I could have written all it down, but it wouldn't be all that good. But this was the scale of what they're riding along over there. Again, under sail. They've probably dropped the sails for the most part, except maybe the one in the front here, so they can maintain some amount of steering, and they've got the anchor hanging off the back. And so the second day they threw out the cargo. On the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands, which basically just means anything that wasn't necessary they start chucking it. And why? Why are they doing that? Why? Yeah, just to give more buoyancy, to keep it up out of the water. Exactly right. And you remember, like we've all studied Jonah, right? They threw everything out of the water then, and then they threw Jonah out of the water too, right? Because of his explanation of what was going on. But this to me reads like it could have been another Jonah as soon as Paul stands up, puts a target on himself, and says, hey, well, you know what? I might be a problem, or at least I have an inside track. He didn't say he's a problem. But the Jonah story that actually happened to Jonah, it continued after, by the way, and it spread. I mean, it's interesting to think about the superstitious, not the godly people that would say, well, we think it's your fault. But verse 20, since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small storm was assailing us, from then on all hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned. When they had gone a long time without food, then Paul stood up in their midst and said, men, you ought to have followed my advice and not to have set sail from Crete and incurred this damage and loss. Yet now I urge you to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood before me, saying, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. Therefore, keep up your courage, men, for I believe God that it will turn out exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on a certain island. So that's faith there, right? Sick. Everybody hasn't eaten. They're all exhausted. And God sends Paul an angel. And if there's a lesson in this chapter, I would suggest that we've read it in these little verses. I think it's an interesting chapter because all the detail it gives of the boat and the ship, let's say that, and how they treated it during the storm and the direction it went, those things all add real evidence, tangibleness to this story of Acts, right? So if they could go, well, this would never happen, right? If ChatGTP put, I don't know, big arms coming out the side of the boat, we say, oh, it doesn't know what it's talking about. If Acts did the same thing about this ship story, then people would go, well, clearly they weren't ever on a ship. So that evidence is good for all of us. But if you look at this phrase, since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small storm was assailing us, from then on, all hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned. They made bad choices, not awful choices, but some amount of bad, unwise choices. We're going to see a little later on, another ship potentially made the same choices and didn't fare as badly. Maybe it was just a little bit of time differently, and we know that the Bible says that time and chance affect us all, right? They made some bad choices and up in a real bad circumstance, and Dave, I'm going to come around to you in a second. And here they are giving up hope. And God is the only way that they have hope now, right? God is the only way that their lives are going to be turned around, and it's not even really because of them and their actions. It's because God had a purpose for Paul and basically said, because you are here, I'm going to grant all these men to you as well. And that is mind-boggling to me, right? That God is hope, even for these men that didn't necessarily deserve it or know God or recognize God and what decisions they had made. That because God had a plan for Paul, in our time, that would be God's providence, right? Not necessarily God picking someone up and placing them in this thing and saying, you're going to go do this, right? We don't have that direct interaction in that way with God now. But God's plan, God's providence, Paul's there, so they all could be saved. David, you had your hand up.
Verse 20 that you were mentioning, Luke is obviously writing this, and it's clearly despondent when he says, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. It's interesting to me that the angel didn't appear to him and said, hold on a minute.
Yeah. You know, I hadn't even thought about that. I hit that we in the study so hard. We did this and we did that. Our, is there any difference in that at all? No. So he says, our hope, our, let's see what the words were there. Our being saved, the hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned. Or what was yours, you said? Completely abandoned? Something? Was at last. There's more finality to that. At last abandoned. Not, it was gradually being abandoned. And Paul's so funny to me. He kind of gives an I told you so in there, didn't he? You know, and yet we could probably all use a I told you so You didn't listen to me last time. Maybe you'll listen to me this time. Can you kind of understand? I told you last time. We used to always tell our girls that experience, the Bible says, is the best way of learning. I would say it's the most thorough way of learning, but it can also be the most expensive, costly way of learning ever, including it may kill you, right? You don't need to learn not to be a drunk driver by experience, meaning dying or killing someone, right? You can just go, oh, look at all the people that say this is a really bad idea. Let's look at all the reports that say it's a bad idea. We can all read that stuff, right? You don't have to experience everything. But in this case, they didn't listen to him, and Paul said, you should have listened to me, but I still have good news. Yes, sir.
I think the lesson, similar to what David was saying, is it's easy to read through this and feel like even Paul constantly was able to communicate with God. And I would say that from this verse, before this angel appeared to him, maybe even Paul didn't realize that they were going to be able to escape this.
I don't know if you can hear him. He said, from the way that verse reads and what Paul had said before, including just a few verses before about we're maybe risking our own lives here, he may have been concerned as well. It is even a man of faith, even a man who communicates directly with God, could be at some point despondent or afraid. That wouldn't be impossible, and you're absolutely right. And so if we say then, for this verse 23, verse 22, keep up courage. There will be no loss of life among you. Verse 23, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood before me. And what he said, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. And I don't want to put too big a point on this. I really don't. But it is interesting that a faithful man, a faithful woman, a faithful family, a faithful household does impact others positively, right? And I think we can see from this example and what's getting ready to happen along the way that the centurion was sure buying into Paul by the end of the story, right? And believing Paul. Perhaps others were. The same thing kind of goes along with Paul everywhere he goes, that maybe people don't think much of him to begin with, but then they sort of grow to respect him. Maybe even Festus a little bit, in that he seemingly sent a decent report. Certainly King Agrippa seemingly grew in respect from Paul in their short time together. And so we do know, I'm not saying necessarily that God says, since you're associated with them, you're going to be fine. I'm not saying that. But I do think that people that are making godly choices affect positively those people around them. And that's probably God's intent, if that makes sense. 25. Therefore, keep up your courage, men, for I believe God that it will turn out exactly as I've been told. Verse 26, but we must run aground on a certain island. I'm sure that was the worst part of his speech to them. Verse 27, but when the 14th night came, this was probably after they had left Fairhaven, right? Not the 14th, it wasn't the 14th from the trip, the 14th night after the Fairhaven. As we were being driven about in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors began to surmise that they were approaching some land. They took some soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms, and a little further on, they took out another sounding and found it to be 15 fathoms. So it's getting more and more shallow. A fathom, I'm not sure most of y'all knows. It's basically, think about it like 6 feet, okay? Think about it as the length of a sailor's arms, and they would tie knots sometimes in a rope so that they could count it as it's dropped off the side, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? And that would tell them how deep that was in fathoms. Then you got to multiply that by 6, and that gives you the feet that we would use more or less. You ever heard about horses measured with hands? Is it exactly whatever that is, 6 inches? Where's my horse family? Okay, so no, and a fathom, it's about 6 feet. Now we would say it's 6 feet. Then it was about an arm's length, 2 arms length. And so they start letting us down. Obviously, they're getting shallower because it went from 120 feet to 90 feet. Verse 29, fearing that we might run aground somewhere on the rocks, they, meaning the ship's crew. Now, we're talking, what do we say, 270 people? I want to go back over there and see that. Look at verse 37. And all of us on the ship were 276 persons, okay? Probably 30 to 40 of that was crew on the minimum side. They may have had extra as well, maybe laborers for loading, unloading, I don't know, and soldiers certainly. But so you've got, as this, okay, the crew, cast 4 anchors from the stern and wished for daybreak. But as the sailors were trying to escape from the ship and had let down the ship's boat into the sea on the pretense of intending to lay out anchors from the bow. Now, I read that terribly. So in verse 29, the crew first let out 4 anchors from the stern, which is the rear of the ship, okay? So they want to slow down. They let out 4 actual anchors, not those 4 sea anchors out there, because they're coming in this way, if they're probably coming in that way, but I don't have the map up. Let's go back to the map. Okay, so they know they're getting close to shore, and they're wanting to slow themselves down. They throw 4 anchors off the back, so the wind is still dragging them, pushing them forward, but now they've got a heavy drag in the back. That's verse 29, hoping for daybreak. But verse 30, as the sailors were trying to escape from the ship and had let down the ship's boat into the sea on the pretense of intending to lay out anchors from the bow. You've got, remember that saying about the dinghy, right, that we talked about earlier? They're saying they're getting in the dinghy only so that they can put out some anchors from up here that would also cast out and slow them down even further, is the idea. And that's what they're telling them. What are they really doing? They're really trying to escape in this big boat that everyone had worked so hard to haul up back in verse 17. Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, let's go back over here. Okay. Unless these men remain in the ship, you yourselves cannot be saved. One thing about that would be, how do you land a ship? How do you dock a ship? What do you call it when it's? How do you ground a ship without the crew? You're not going to be able to do that, right? That's one way of saying it. Another way it could be saying it, you know what? All that stuff I said about God and Him weighing in, He said we all had to stay here, and if they get off, you're not going to be saved either. Totally possible to read it either way, as far as I'm concerned. But the fact remains that verse 32, the centurion evidently believed Paul, and the soldiers believed Paul, because in verse 32 it says, then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it fall away. So they are, I don't have to keep going back to this picture. You've seen it already, but now I kind of liking it, I guess. So they're putting out over here, right there, if you can see it. They're putting it out over here by rope, and the soldiers come, push them out of the way, cut that loose, and now it's going to be gone, right? They're not going to see it again because of the storm that they're in. And verse 33. Until the day was about to dawn, Paul was encouraging them all to take some food, saying, today is the 14th day that you have been constantly watching and going without eating, having taken nothing. Therefore, I encourage you to take some food, for this is for your preservation, for not a hair from the head of any of you will perish. Again, that faith. Having said this, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all, and he broke it and began to eat. Why do we give thanks every time we eat? Because that's what they do in the Bible. They do that. Christ did it before he ate in the Gospels. Paul did it here before he ate among these unsaved people. He gave thanks to God in the presence of all and broke it and began to eat. What a good example. All of them were encouraged, and they took themselves also the food. Verse 37, all of us in the ship were 276 persons. Verse 38, when they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing out the wheat into the sea. So they finally said, look, we don't care what Rome thinks. We're getting rid of what this stuff. Why? Because if you start coming in on land, you want to come in as high as possible so that you can be as close to the shore as possible. So now they're giving up on the wheat. When day came, they could not recognize the land, but they did observe a bay with a beach, and they resolved to drive the ship into it if they could. And casting off the anchors, they let them in the sea, while at the same time they were loosening the ropes of the rudders and hoisting the foresail of the wind. They were heading for the beach. So what are they doing? They're cutting off the anchors. They're loosening their steering mechanism, right? The rudders, and they're really kind of rudder oars, they say, but they're loosening those. They'd been tied up. Otherwise, they'd get ripped off with the storm, right? And they put up a sail because the idea now is we think land is close. We're going to get as much speed as we can, as high as we can on the water, so we can get as close as we can into the island or into the beach. And verse 41, but that's a tough word there. But they didn't get up to the beach. Striking a reef where the two seas met, they ran the vessel aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable, but the stern began to be broken up by the force of the waves. 42, the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that none of them would swim away and escape. What chapter was the Philippian jailer in Acts that we studied? Acts what? 16. Was it 16? It was 13 or 16? It was 16, the second trip. Acts 16, the beginning of the second trip. What was the Philippian jailer going to do when he thought everyone had escaped? Kill himself. Why? Because if he let all of the prisoners escape, Rome was going to require his life from him in who knows what kind of horrible way. And so he was going to kill himself. I am sure that was going in their mind too. Their plan was to kill the prisoners so that none of them would swim away and escape. But the centurion wanting to bring Paul safely through, Julius wanting to bring Paul safely through, kept them from their intention and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest should follow, some on planks and others on various things from the ship. And so it happened that they all were brought safely to land. And I'm going to read verse 1. When they had been brought safely through, then we found out that the island was called Malta or Melita, which means refuge. And so the interesting thing is, did they say, so we found out why this island is called refuge? Or are they saying that they found out that that was the name of the island because it certainly was a refuge to them and they were all saved? Now, we got a couple of minutes. I don't really even want to go into 28 yet. So y'all have anything you want to add? Now would be the time to do that. Yes, sir. Is that Joe back there? I can't see that far.
So what God is doing here is he's building Paul's credibility with this cohort that he's going to go into eventually in Rome. He's actually flipped where Paul is guiding the centurion on what to see.
I like that. These men likely are no strangers to Rome. We know they have some authority in Rome, and they're going to be bringing in a big entourage into Rome all the way down the Appian Way and all the way getting into Rome, and they're all going to be able to testify in some way, be a witness to these things that happened with Paul on the ship and what Paul said happened, and they were all saved. You're absolutely right. That's a great point. Thank you. Anybody else? Not looking that way. Okay. All right. Chapter 28. When they had been brought safely through, then we found out that the island was called Malta or Melita. The natives showed us extraordinary kindness, for because of the rain that had set in and because of the cold, they kindled a fire and received us all. I just think that, you talk about hospitality. I think it's funny that some of your translations probably call them barbarians. Some of them say natives. Barbarians then didn't mean ruffian, uncouth people. It just meant they didn't speak Greek or Hebrew, probably. That's it. And so these barbarians, these non-Greek speaking folks on the island, they brought them in with hospitality. Look over at 1 Corinthians 14:18. I didn't have a place for this verse most of my life. It's kind of interesting, but it says, Paul says, I thank God I speak in tongues more than you all. However, in the church, I desire to speak 5 words with my mind so I can instruct others also. But tongues, what are tongues? Languages. I speak more languages as a gift, right, from God. So could he talk to all these people? Probably, yeah, probably. I think that's interesting to think about. The idea that he speaks more tongues than anybody. I don't know if he's traveled more than most. But maybe that's a place to put that in here. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to being with you on whatever's next Sunday. Thank you.